So what I have here is some Nye oil. NYE is the manufacturer, Nye. And all I want was put a little drop right at that rivet point and then work that. It'll soon find its way in and that action will be nice and smooth. We don't need any excess on there. All it takes is just a hint of lubricant really. That's good. And that now is ready to go into the body. It's always a fight to get this arm in. It doesn't want to go. That's in. At the top we have to get a screw in here, so I'm just seeing if I can encourage that arm across where I can see it. And there are two screws that go in on that front surface there. I can get them in place and then I'll fight with the other. My video camera is busy flashing at me and telling me that the battery is about to expire, and it may or may not be telling the truth. I'll keep going till I hear the magic beep and then I'll know I've pushed my luck too far. Here's the screw for the arm at the top. I can see that arm has just moved over this way a bit. Let's see if I can encourage it back. Oh, that would be too easy. That's it, we're in business. We encourage that arm back into position. Take that screw, run that into the threaded bush on the top of that arm, nip that screw up tight, apply a little bit of synthetic grease to that slot either side of that screw. I'll take this rubber band off for the moment. You'll be able to see what happens. As I push the front of the camera back and close it, that screw follows the track and then it disappears off into the body. Naturally I pushed my luck a little bit too far and the camera shut down because the battery went flat. Just checking that that screw's tight. That's all good. If I slide this back in, that post disappears back into the body smoothly. Next, the transfer shaft from the back of the camera is a two-piece arrangement. Basically the inner connects up to the cocking rack at the back. It couples to this outer piece at the front, and this piece here drives the shutter to cock it. So we'll take our outer, I'm putting a little bit of grease in the inside, a little bit on the outside here where it runs in the body. This has to pick up that transfer shaft from the back of the camera. I can feel it pick up there. I'll put a smear on this front surface where this runs in this guide bush, this cover. Drop that cover into place. We have two screws, chromed brass, fairly easily marked, fairly easily damaged. The one at the top is easy to get to and easy to see. You need the pretty one there. The one at the bottom is more difficult to get to. If you've managed to damage one of the screws, or if somebody before you has damaged one of the screws, put the ugly screw down here where it's not going to be seen. Retain the pretty one for up the top where people can see it. I'll nip those screws up. Those screws are brass. If you overdo it, tightening them up, you'll break them. And if you break them, there'll be lots of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right, that's nice and smooth. If I look down from the top, which you won't be able to see much at all, or if I rotate the gear at the front there, I can see the gear on the cocking rack rotating too. You won't be able to see that, that's well hidden and down in a dark place. That part of the camera is done. There are other jobs to be done here. One is to fit the return spring, in this case that goes on the shutter release shaft here. Again, that's another component that's extremely keen to get away and disappear in back between the shroud and the bellows if you're looking the wrong way, and if anything inopportune like the shutter release lifts out of the body. So I will put that in at a later stage, being very careful, giving it minimal opportunity to get away. Next, we need to think about doing the film advance mechanism. And that starts with our lock lever and our release lever. The release lever has a spring on it, which most typically I would have removed prior to cleaning so that I don't damage it. In this case I haven't, but it appears to have escaped unscathed. That's a wee bonus. But there is a spring on this arm that's sitting in position. So we certainly want those two components. They are held in with a screw from the top in the case of the release lever, and a circlip or E-clip or C-clip or something else, depending on where you live, at the bottom of the camera. These two components have return springs, and they look fairly similar. The return spring for the release lever is a coarser spring. It's a stronger spring. The one for the lock lever is the lighter spring. Smaller number of coils and smaller gauge of wire. Right, so those components are our next problem. I'll get ready to do that. Let's get these components back in the body. So some molybdenum, a wipe of molybdenum where the shaft for the lock lever and release lever run, and a wipe of molybdenum on the surface here where the return spring for the release lever runs. And I'll start with the lock lever. That drops in here. At the top of the camera we need the spring. There are two springs. It was the lighter of the two springs. And I'm holding that spring down with my thumb below the slot that the circlip fits into, and I'll press that circlip into place. That lever is now correctly sitting in place. Now I've heard that shutter release shaft busy trying to get away there. I'd sort of touched that with my thumb and it took the opportunity to jump. So this lever, our release lever, that drops in here. Be careful swinging it into place so you don't damage the return spring. I'll just line it up from the top. We're miles away there. Swing that lever's sitting down into place nicely. Its return spring goes on the top, and then its screw. This is adjustable. It's adjustable so that you can adjust the stroke of the shutter release so that the shutter fires at or about the same time that the film mechanism is released to allow you to wind on for the next shot. The screw on the top of that, it was quite marked. It tells me that someone's been fiddling with that to adjust it and struggling. Given the state of it, they were probably trying to achieve that while the meter and everything was in place, and so the screwdriver didn't have an ideal angle of attack. Film advance shaft. We want that. Our plastic take-up spool. And the metal bush that fits into the bottom of the film advance shaft. I'm looking at the shaft. The main thing I'm interested in here is making sure that the cam plate on the end of the shaft is tight. It's riveted on there. I need to make sure that it's riveted on tight. I'm also looking at it to see if it's bent at all. The camera's been dropped. It's not uncommon for the film advance lever to strike the ground or strike some object, and that almost certainly is not going to hit it right in the centre. It'll hit it on one side or the other. This shaft is only brass, it bends, and then you've got your lever sitting at less than 90 degrees to the shaft, and so it swings upwards and downwards as it swings through its arc, and may or may not contact the camera body. That all looks good. No obvious problem there. I'm just looking at the there's a little bit of white residue there. That will be from the grease. I'll just brush that away. That's all good. To lubricate this, I normally use graphite grease because I like the feel of it. I like the way the mechanism works. So I just pull back that collar on the spring, apply some to the shaft. Of course, it's not playing the game. Make sure I've got it rubbed onto that shaft all the way around. Check the action. And it feels nice and smooth. Apply some to the spring itself so that the coils of the spring slide over each other smoothly as it's being wound up. That seems quite good. Let's put a bit above that collar. The last coil of this spring tends to bite into the shaft at this point here, and I can feel a ridge there. That's by no means a severe example. That's just part and parcel of that design and the fact that the shaft is brass and it's quite soft. The cam plate on both sides of this, there's an upper and a lower cam plate, and those ratchet teeth on that cam plate I'm just lubricating now with a bit of synthetic grease so that the lock lever and release lever moves smoothly across those surfaces. Opening the back of the camera, we'll take our take-up spool, fit the bush in place, goes in the hole, plain hole at the bottom. The one with the notches in goes to the top. We can drop that into place in the body, shut the back, drop my film advance shaft in, and I've got to get this fixed down in place. So I've pushed up and swung the lock lever out of the way, and I'll just revolve this shaft until it's in the normal position it'll sit, the start position for the winding stroke. Which is right there. Let that lock lever drop back in, and the release lever's dropped in. That's good. Make sure that the holes are aligned here to get my screws in, and they're not. There they are. And 3 screws go in there. They're nickel plated screws, countersunk heads, the same as is used to fix the chrome trim on the base of the camera. The ones that were used in this film advance will typically be the cleaner of the two, because the ones that were used on the base often will have some glue residue on them, and even if they don't have glue residue on them, chances are they're slightly more scarred up because it was more of a problem getting the screws out of the base of the camera because of the amount of glue that they had on them at the time. So we'll get these 3 screws in place. I'm just choosing 3 likely suspects. In this case, because I've run the screws through the degreaser and the ultrasonic cleaner, they all look pretty much the same. They're all fairly evenly clean. Once the 3 screws are in position and are snugged down, you can go around and tighten them up. Keep in mind that the screws are all relatively small in diameter. If you're heavy-handed, you'll strip the screws out. That would be a major nuisance. So be cautious. How tight to do things up, to be quite honest, it's the feel of the thing, and it's something you learn from experience. I used to work next to a person who couldn't restrain themselves from applying their full force every time they needed to do something up, and they just spent their entire life stripping out screws and making a mess of things. They didn't seem to be able to learn. If it's too loose, well, at least you can come back at a later date and tighten it up. If you do it too tight and you snap the screw or strip the screw thread out, that's a problem. That's going to take some serious engineering to fix that. So I'm using the graphite grease again here, and I've got to get this clutch assembly assembled. 3 pieces. The springy piece here, that's what gives us our tension, gives us our friction that binds the 2 parts together. It's entertaining trying to get this together. I've got to find the right pliers. Got some nice cheap crimp pliers here, rounded jaws, works well for this task. So I've got to assemble this. So this spring has a little tab that sticks up at the top. That tab has to engage with the slot in the inner piece of this clutch assembly. So I lay that into place. Stick my pliers on there and squeezing that lightly to compress the spring. I'm rotating that clockwise in the pliers, which is pulling more and more of the spring in as I go until it's all pulled into position. Then this piece goes on the outer. This goes on, in some cameras this goes on in either position. This one's got a little recess at one end, and the recess goes towards the bottom here. Yeah, that's just sprung out of position slightly. See if I can squeeze that back. That's right. Okay, so there's my clutch assembly. The clutch assembly will always move much smoother in one direction than the other. That's quite normal. And the direction that it's moving smoothly in is the direction it needs to move. It doesn't need to move in the other direction at all. And I've said this before, but I'll explain it again to people who haven't heard it. The clutch is important because it allows for controlled slippage of the take-up spool relative to the sprocket shaft. If, as the film is drawn through the camera, it builds up on the take-up spool, and as that diameter increases, it pulls more and more film through with each rotation. If there was no clutch, you would have the sprocket shaft and the take-up spool fighting against each other. And what that inevitably would mean is that either the film breaks or the sprocket holes are stripped out of the film. By allowing for some controlled slippage, you don't have that problem. The take-up spool keeps tension on the film. The sprocket shaft meters the amount of film that's coming through the camera. The take-up spool has controlled slippage. It can only move through as much film or wind up as much film as the sprocket shaft will allow to pass through the camera on a single wind. So I'm getting this bush in place. This is the bush for the top of the film advance. Keeps the top of the film advance shaft in position. And it has a ratchet on one side and a support post on the other side that supports the rack. So this, on the ratchet side, there's a little metal bush. Now the little metal bush is slightly countersunk on one side. The countersunk side goes downwards. The plane side goes up. If you mix the two surfaces up, you'll have a bad time. I'll get this in place. There's a return spring goes on this screw. Just checking that, make sure that it passes through the bush and the little ratchet pull smoothly. That looks good. I'll nip those screws up just lightly. I'm going to come back to those. The spring. There's a return spring that goes on that pull. It's quite fine. Like all fine springs, it'll do its best to run away into the bushes if you're not careful. I'm going to get that in position. That's seated on that screw. I'll just zoom you in a bit. And you can see it acts against this pull to push it towards the centre. Here we have this gear which couples the mechanism here to the gear down here, which in turn couples through to the sprocket down below. Now I'm just looking at the state of this. There's a mark there, some corrosion. It looks like that's all loose. Yep, that was a little bit of corrosion. But that's all come loose from the ultrasonic cleaner. It just needed to be wiped away. So normally I apply a little bit of grease in here, some in the centre and some at the outside. This just drops on the top there. In rotating this counterclockwise, it should push the pawl out of the way and revolve onto the shaft, meshing with this gear here. That looks good. Just checking at the base of the camera, everything's still in place. Now, for ease of assembly, I'm just going to put the film advance lever on the base temporarily. A single screw will do it, and that's because when you're working on the top part of this camera, it's easy to push that shaft down, and that can be a nuisance. That's good, that's sitting as it should, that's all in place. We have this spring. I'm just giving that a very quick wipe with synthetic grease, not because it needs it in order to function, but to protect it from corrosion. That steel is otherwise prone to corrosion. A little bit of oil or something on that certainly doesn't hurt. So there's the drive dog that it runs against. Now this piece is flat on one side and has notches or slight angled slots on the other. The flat side goes down. This drive dog, that goes on next. Get that positioned, that's better. This washer doesn't want to pick up. That very thin washer goes on there next. Then the drive gear that couples to the shutter cocking rack, that goes on. That all centered down into place nicely. And the retaining screw with a notch either side to engage the driver just fits in there. I'll just run that down. If the lock lever is correctly placed, that will stop the film advance shaft from being able to rotate, so you can tighten the screw up against that. I'll just nip that up tight. That's good. Now I've got no tension on the rewind on the advance here to return that lever, but I'm just checking the action to make sure that the gearing and everything works smoothly. Press down on the top of this screw head here, that's the release lever. I'm only moving it a little way. Hold my finger down slightly on the lock lever, as it would do at any position other than number 1, and I can rotate the film advance lever and then rotate it back to the start position. Everything moved smoothly. That's all good, that's a good result. Next I want to get the rewind button lock lever back in position. So I'll remove this film advance lever. Find my components. I want the lever. Its spring is a stepped spring with those collared areas on it. One of them is for the spring to revolve round, the other one is for the lever to revolve about, and its return spring there. The lever, this rounded end on it that runs against the film advance mechanism. I'm just putting a bit of molybdenum paste on there, and for good measure I'll just run some through the pivot hole in the centre. So you could use anything to lubricate that pivot hole, but the molybdenum paste is in my hand, so that's what I'm using. Slide this into position. Put its return spring loosely in position. And put the screw into position. Just check that I haven't trapped that lever, that it's fitted to the screw correctly, and it is. I'll nip that screw up. The spring, I need to pull this loose end of the spring back behind the tab over here. So I'm just finding a suitable pair of tweezers. That's it. So that's sprung loaded, that's all good. Next I want to put the sprocket back in, the sprocket shaft. The screw that couples the sprocket shaft to the sprocket here. And then we'll want the rewind button washer, the rewind button, and the return spring for the rewind button. So starting with the shaft, I'll put a bit of synthetic grease on the shaft towards the top, towards the bottom. You can probably see wear marks on there where things have been revolving. Open the back of the camera, put the sprocket in place, the slot goes to the top, drop the shaft into position, if that's tight, it's because this gear is a bit close. Just slacken these two screws off slightly. That's better. So put that shaft into position. It feeds down through the body. Should pick up the hole in the bottom casting. There it goes. I've got my finger on that gear at the top there to hold it in position. I can pull back this lever with the tweezers, and that allows this shaft to pop all the way to the bottom. If it doesn't pop in all the way, that's because the gear isn't meshed with the other gear. Just rotate your film spool slightly and it will. And that's sitting in the rest position now. Just rotate my film spool until the screw hole lines up with the slot there. Get that screw into position.